The policy of a state lies in its geography.
Gunboat diplomacy. Starmer, he's a weak and incompetent leader. They are pro NATO, they are pro US.
$1 trillion annually?
To pay reparations to the African people.
Not to the enslaved, but to slave owners.
Reform UK, they could possibly be the next British government.
You live in the capital of this system.
Huge mobilizations in support of the Palestinian people.
Slave trade as a crime against humanity.
Many honest British people are disgusted by the past history of the country.
The policy of a state lies in its geography, wrote Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, that idea feels less like a historical observation and more like a strategic reality. Hello and welcome. You're watching a channel where we discuss international politics without simplifications or illusions. If you value this kind of conversation, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss upcoming interviews. Today's guest is Dr. Hudson, a researcher of British politics, political economy, and post-colonial legacy. Dr. Hudson, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
It's our pleasure. Let's begin with a central tension. The United Kingdom today invokes freedom of navigation while simultaneously discussing the use of force at sea. For many, this signals a shift from rules to power. Dr. Hudson, Prime Minister Starmer has effectively authorized forceful action against vessels of the so-called Shadow Fleet in British territorial waters, while Defense Secretary Healey has spoken about a hard landing scenario. How is this initiative perceived in London? Is there a serious debate in the media and Parliament that such actions resemble outright piracy and undermine the principle of freedom of navigation?
Well, to answer your question, the media is not really saying a lot about it. I mean, obviously, we've seen some things about the discussions the British government is having with France and other countries about restricting the rights to navigation and about, I mean, it's really what we used to call gunboat diplomacy. It's not been discussed in the mainstream media. It's not being debated. I mean, all they are putting across is the view of the government. And similarly, in Parliament, there's no debate about it. The potential for creating a dangerous situation by doing this, I think, is very apparent. But no one in Parliament is getting up to criticise the government or trying to debate the matter. The problem is the mainstream parties that are represented in Parliament all really just represents the ruling elite. They are pro NATO, they are pro US. There isn't really much difference between them. And I think this is illustrated by the fact they're not discussing these actions, which, as you say, amount to piracy on the high seas and are a violation of international law and run the risk of creating extreme tension and conflict, which we do not need, and we I think we know where such a conflict could go.
When domestic standing weakens, foreign policy can become a tool of compensation. Starmer's approval ratings are declining rapidly right now, including amid the collapse of the Chagos deal with Mauritius. There's a view that actions against the Shadow Fleet could serve as a small victorious war narrative against a Russian threat to offset setbacks elsewhere. How close is this interpretation to discussions within the British political class?
Well, again, it's not been this viewpoint is not being discussed by the British political class, but I think it is a correct viewpoint that Starmer is looking for a victory. He's looking to try and look strong. The media say that he is a weak leader. He's a weak and incompetent leader. Definitely, he's declining in popularity. The Labour Party is very low in the opinion polls. It is now, I think, at fourth or fifth position in the opinion polls. Recently, the Green Party won a by-election in Manchester, and the far-right Reform Party under Nigel Farage are making a lot of gains. So Starmer is looking for something that's going to make him look strong, look like he's standing up for British interests, and he's being tough with the Russians. And there is a precedent for this. This was done by Thatcher during the Falklands or Malvinas conflict, where off the coast of Argentina, there are the Malvina Islands, which are called the Falkland Islands by the British, and which have a small British colony on them. And in 1982, Argentina decided to assert its sovereignty over the Malvinas and occupied the Malvinas Island. So the British government under Thatcher, instead of negotiating, they launched a war and sent a big naval task force to the Falklands to take back the islands by force. And of course, this boosted Thatcher's popularity greatly, which at the time had been bad because she was associated with mass unemployment, with poverty, with declining living standards. And I think Starmer is trying to do the same thing by having a confrontation with the Russian Federation, trying to look tough, trying to make it look like he's asserting Britain's interests, because he is seen as an incredibly weak leader who doesn't defend Britain's interests, and is even talking about taking Britain back into the European Union or some kind of accommodation with the European Union.
However, moral leadership is difficult to claim without confronting historical responsibility. My next question is about the United Kingdom was the largest participant in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting around 3 million Africans when slavery was abolished in 1833. Parliament allocated 20 million British pounds in compensation, not to the enslaved, but to slave owners, roughly 40% of the annual budget. How honestly is this history addressed today in British schools, museums, and public discourse, or does a more comfortable, civilizing empire narrative still prevail?
Well, I think the question is dealt with in a very mixed way, with differing responses to it. There is a museum of the slave trade in Liverpool, which I've visited, and that deals with the subject in a fairly honest way. And I think it is also many schools teach their children about the slave trade. However, there are those who say that gets information about Britain's responsibility in the slave trade, about its crimes against the African people, should not be taught. And that's even people saying, well, really, it was just business. Britain did nothing wrong. That is the response of some people. So it is a mixed response. It is a subject that is debated in the media and on social media. It's something that's debated. There is also a campaign to pay reparations to the African people for the slave trade, but it is strongly opposed by certain elements within the United Kingdom.
Ideas once considered fringe are increasingly shaping the political mainstream. Reform UK openly proposes linking visa policy to the issue of reparations, effectively leveraging freedom of movement for citizens of former colonies. You observe this party from within. Is it still marginal, or are we seeing its rhetoric influence the mainstream, including conservatives and even signals from Labour?
Yes, I mean, I would say several things to your question. Reform UK has become very much part of the mainstream. It has been leading in opinion polls. Nowadays, the two most popular parties are Reform UK and the Greens. And I certainly think Reform UK is replacing the Conservative Party as the main right-wing party. Many Conservatives have left the Conservative Party and have joined Reform UK. So they are becoming quite big. They could possibly be the next British government when a British general election is held in 2029, or possibly earlier if one is forced by opposition parties. And Reform UK, to me, they are like a hybrid between right-wing conservatism and fascism. And increasingly, they have been adopting slogans and policies that were last heard of from fascist parties like the National Front and the British movement in the 1970s. They're not simply calling for a restriction of immigration. And of course, I mean, I personally, I don't disagree with the idea of controlling immigration. It's simply how this is done. But Reform UK are now, they're not calling for simply restrictions or controls on immigration. They're actually calling for repatriation. They're calling for mass deportations. They're calling for remigration. And as like you said, this was an idea that once only came from very far right or fascist parties in the UK. So they are very much part of the British political scene. And I think it is a very dangerous situation where racial conflict could break out in the UK.
Thank you. Well, sometimes the most revealing contradictions are embodied in individuals. There's a notable case is Kemi Badenoch, a Black politician and leader of the Conservative Party, who calls the Chagos deal disgrace, yet does not publicly reference the indigenous population forcibly removed in the 60s, 70s. How do you explain this paradox, where a representative of the post colonial world reproduces a classic imperial narrative.
Yeah, she's certainly taking an imperialist view. I mean, what happened to the Chagos Islanders was an absolute disgrace, uh, and the island should be handed back. Uh, uh, and to me, it's crazy that she's opposing such a deal. But I think it shows that she is very much part of the system. I think she is a hypocrite, but she's also, I think, representative of the Black and Asian middle class in the UK, who do some of whom do side and do identify with colonialism, uh, rather than with the peoples of the global south.
The Chiga story is not only about diplomacy, right? But about what is deliberately left out of the conversation. The Chiga's case reflects more than a diplomatic failure. The UK refuses to comply with UN resolutions, delays sovereignty transfer under US pressure, and deprives Martianists of roughly $215 million annually. How is this issue covered in British media? And why, in your view, does the core issue often disappear from public debate, namely the Diego Garcia base that underpins the entire situation?
I think it's an issue which there is a sort of split down the middle with the left supporting the islanders and supporting their case, and the right actually supporting colonialism, supporting the British government, and supporting the US, who had the base on Diego Garcia, and it is not really. I think the issue is not really fairly discussed in the media, because the media here is controlled. It is a corporate media, so they don't want to discuss it, and they've only often publicised very right wing views, like when there was talk of the British government finally handing back the islands to Mauritius. The press here gave a lot of publicity to people like Nigel Farage and others who said, "Oh, this was a betrayal of British national interests. We can't possibly give up the islands." And these views were publicised a lot in the mainstream media and on social media.
Economic structures often speak louder than political rhetoric. The City of London sits at the center of a global network of tax havens through which the global south is estimated to lose over $1 trillion annually. You live in the capital of this system. Is an honest conversation about reparations and historical justice even possible while these financial mechanisms remain intact? And other forces within British society willing to challenge them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is the case that you can't have an honest conversation with these people. The City of London, sometimes called the richest square mile in the world, because it is actually a tiny part of London. That is really like the unelected government of the UK. They're the ones with the real power, but no one elected them. However, there are forces, there are progressive forces like anti-imperialist movements, like the peace movement, and which challenge these kind of views. And I think it's been encouraging in the last 3 years we've seen huge mobilizations in support of the Palestinian people, which, has attracted hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people, and they've been able to sustain a big campaign around the issue, and I think that shows the potential to develop the anti-imperialist movement in Britain and the peace movement and the progressive movement. So, I mean, this kind of energy that we've seen over the last few years could be turned to other issues.
Still, reparations are moving from academic debate into political reality. Reparations frameworks proposed by CARICOM and the African Union include not only financial compensation, but also cultural restitution, investments in healthcare and education, and formal apologies. Do you see allies within the UK in academia, trade unions, left movements, or diasporas? Or is this struggle largely external to the former metropole?
No, I think it is the case that there is support within academia, within the trade unions, within peace movements, within the diaspora. I think there is support for it. And many honest British people are disgusted by the past history of the country. And in fact, a few years ago, a statue of a slave trader that was in Bristol was toppled and thrown into the water. I think that shows that there is both understanding and anger about this. However, this will, of course, be opposed by our ruling circles, by the City of London, by monopoly and finance capital, and by right-wing politicians like Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson. And I have a final question for today. International institutions are increasingly arena of political leverage rather than neutral justice. In March 2026, the UN classified the slave trade as a crime against humanity of the gravest kind. Is it realistic to discuss revisiting the UK's position in the UN Human Rights Council, or does this remain primarily a moral rather than a legal political tool of pressure?
Right. Well, I think really a lot of these UN bodies don't really lack authority. And I think the reason for this is for years they've been used by the US and the Western powers as an instrument of their foreign policy and as a means of attacking countries they don't like. So I think this has undermined the role of the UN. And I think, I mean, with the whole issue of the slave trade, yes, there is a strong moral case that I think the legal and institutional case is more difficult, and particularly with the UK's legal system, which favours the rich and powerful and the status quo. I think it will be difficult to deal with it through legal and institutional mechanisms. And I think the best way is by building mass pressure and a mass movement around this.
Thank you for this conversation. It was good to hear your thoughts on these issues.
Thank you for interviewing me.
If you found this interview valuable, support it. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment. I'm your host, Daria Pick. See you next time on Points News.